The settlement of Maga, located 45 kilometers southeast of Leningrad, was a small but strategically decisive railway junction. Its position on the Moscow-Leningrad and Maga-Volkhov lines made it one of the most important transport nodes in the entire northwestern theater of war. Whoever controlled Maga could dictate whether supplies and reinforcements reached Leningrad from the east or whether the city remained encircled and starved. The German High Command identified Maga as a crucial point during the summer campaign of 1941, while Soviet planners understood that its loss would choke the last arteries sustaining the besieged metropolis. Between August 1941 and January 1943, this modest junction became the focus of repeated offensives and counteroffensives, costing both sides tens of thousands of casualties and leaving the region permanently scarred. The preconditions of this struggle were rooted in the wider German invasion of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, launched on 22 June 1941, struck the Soviet northwestern, western, and southwestern fronts simultaneously. Army Group North under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb advanced from East Prussia and the Baltic states toward Leningrad. By mid-July, German forces had reached the Luga River line, threatening to envelop the northern capital. The Wehrmacht sought not only to capture Leningrad, but also to isolate it completely from external aid, forcing its surrender by starvation and bombardment rather than by costly street fighting. To achieve this, control of the railways feeding the city was essential. Maga became the prime target because it linked Leningrad with the Volkhov River crossings and the rail corridor to Moscow. On the Soviet side, the northwestern and northern fronts, later reorganized into the Leningrad front, bore the brunt of the defense. Commanders such as Marshal Kliment Voroshilov, General Georgy Zhukov, and later Marshal Leonid Govorov understood that Leningrad's survival depended on preserving at least one reliable supply route. At the beginning of the war, Leningrad had more than 2.5 million civilian inhabitants and around 600,000 troops stationed in the region. Food stocks were already limited, with rations calculated to last only a few months without new deliveries. Soviet intelligence correctly estimated that the German High Command prioritized cutting rail and road lines to force the city into famine conditions. Thus, from the earliest days of the siege, Maga emerged as one of the most hotly contested objectives on the Eastern Front. In late July 1941, German forces of the 4th Panzer Group and 18th Army advanced toward Maga as part of the wider Leningrad encirclement plan. The Soviet 54th Army, supported by remnants of the 48th and 67th Armies, However, the Red Army was still reeling from catastrophic defeats in Belarus and the Baltics. Equipment losses were immense. The Soviet Northwestern Front alone had lost over 2,000 tanks and more than 1,500 aircraft during the first month of fighting. Infantry formations defending Mamja often fought with depleted ammunition stocks, short supplies of artillery shells, and inadequate air support. The Luftwaffe maintained clear superiority, flying more than 1,000 sorties in August against Soviet positions around Leningrad, and Maga German operational planning emphasized speed and encirclement. By seizing Maga, the Wehrmacht intended to sever the Leningrad-Volkhov rail line, making it impossible for the Soviets to maintain logistical links across Lake Ladoga or to bring in reinforcements from the east. For von Leeb's Army Group North, capturing Maga was considered a step toward final encirclement of Leningrad. Hitler himself repeatedly emphasized in directives that the city must not be stormed directly, but must instead be sealed off like a fortress. In practice, this meant that places such as Emga, Schlisselburg, and Tikhvin became linchpins in the German strategy. For the civilian population of Leningrad, the looming loss of Maga was already a catastrophe in the making. Even before the Germans reached the junction, food distribution in the city had been reduced. By mid-August 1941, bread rations were cut to 600 grams per day for workers and 400 grams for dependents. Without control of Maga, Soviet authorities anticipated that rations would decline further to survival levels. Refugee columns, numbering in the tens of thousands, streamed out of the contested areas toward Leningrad, often under artillery fire. Many of these civilians carried first. In summary, the preconditions for the Battle of Muga were created by the German drive to strangle Leningrad through isolation and siege, countered by the Soviet determination to maintain at least one supply artery to the besieged city. The small railway junction, insignificant in peacetime, became a focal point of global strategic importance. By August 1941, both sides had already accepted that control of Muga would be fought for at extraordinary human cost, setting the stage for 2 years of bloodshed that turned the area into one of the most heavily contested sectors of the entire Eastern Front. In early August 1941, the German push toward Muga accelerated as Army Group North sought to close the ring around Leningrad. The opening phase of the battle was characterized by fast-moving armored thrusts, combined with concentrated artillery fire and airstrikes, designed to overwhelm. The 20th Motorized Division and elements of the 121st Infantry Division were assigned the task of capturing Muga, supported by tanks from the 8th Panzer Division. Their advance was coordinated with units of the 4th Panzer Group moving from the south toward the Neva River. German field reports from this period indicate confidence that Muga could be seized within days, given the collapsing Soviet front lines in the Baltic and Novgorod directions. Soviet defenders, however, recognized the significance of the junction and rushed reinforcements into the area. The recently formed 48th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Stepan Akimov, along with remnants of the 54th Army under General Ivan Fedyuninsky, attempted to establish a defensive perimeter east of Leningrad. Soviet troops occupied forested terrain, dug trenches along railway embankments, and set up machine gun nests in villages surrounding the junction. Yet their positions were vulnerable, communication lines were fragile, artillery support was thin, and air cover was almost non-existent. The VVS Northern Front could muster only a handful of serviceable aircraft in the sector, while the Luftwaffe maintained dozens of bombers and fighters operating out of captured airfields near Pskov and Gatchina. The German attack began in earnest on 30 August 1941. Heavy bombardments preceded infantry assaults along the Moscow-Leningrad Railway. By 31 August, German spearheads had reached the outskirts of Muga Street. Fighting broke out, with Soviet defenders using railway cars, warehouses, and embankments as improvised strongpoints. The Germans advanced methodically, clearing block by block with flamethrowers and grenades. Despite the desperate resistance, German troops seized the station. In just 48 hours, the last direct rail link into the city was lost. The immediate consequences were severe. Soviet supply trains were halted, and civilian food reserves in Leningrad dwindled further. With Muga in German hands, the only tenuous line of supply was across Lake Ladoga, which would not be organized until later in the autumn. The fall of Muga also opened the path to Schlisselburg on the southern shore of Ladoga. On 8 September, German forces captured Schlisselburg, sealing the encirclement of Leningrad from the land. The siege, which would last for 872 days, had begun. During this first phase of combat, casualties were already heavy. German reports recorded several hundred killed and wounded in the fighting for the town and its approaches, while Soviet losses were much higher, estimated at 6,000, 8,000 men killed, wounded. Entire Red Army battalions were trapped when German units cut off retreat routes through swampy terrain east of Muga. Prisoner interrogations later revealed that many Soviet formations had been committed piecemeal, with little coordination between units, due to the urgency of stopping the German advance. For the population of Leningrad, the loss of Muga marked a turning point. Bread rations were reduced again in September, and the city braced for isolation. Soviet propaganda framed the fall of Muga as a temporary setback, promising that counteroffensives would soon restore communications. In reality, the Red Army was in no position to launch a large-scale attack immediately. Its forces were exhausted from continuous retreats, and reserves were stretched thin across the entire eastern front. Nevertheless, Stavka began planning efforts to retake the junction, fully aware that without Mega, Leningrad's survival was in jeopardy. The opening phase of the battle thus concluded with a decisive German success. In less than a week, they achieved a primary objective of Operation Barbarossa in the north, severing the rail lifeline to Leningrad. Yet this success was not final. The Soviets, though battered, refused to abandon the fight. Manga would become the focal point of repeated Soviet offensives in late 1941 and throughout 1942, as Moscow demanded the reopening of supply routes to sustain the besieged city. What began as a rapid German advance would evolve into a prolonged and bloody struggle, fought over the same railway lines and villages for more than 2 years. After the capture of Miga in September 1941, German command integrated the junction into its broader strategy of encirclement and attrition around Leningrad. The initial success of seizing the station had cut off direct rail access to the strategic objective remained to maintain and consolidate control over Maga while preventing Soviet counterattacks from reopening communications. This required not only defending the station itself, but also holding surrounding villages, bridges, and forested corridors that could provide avenues of approach for Soviet forces. The Germans established fortified positions, laying mines along railway tracks, building bunkers from timber and earth, and deploying artillery in concealed positions around the marshy terrain. Units from the 18th Army, including the 121st Infantry Division, remained in the area, with reinforcements from reserve divisions rotated in to stabilize the front. For the Soviets, the loss of Manga immediately triggered a series of urgent planning sessions at the Stavka level. On 10th of September 1941, Joseph Stalin personally demanded a counteroffensive to recapture the junction. The Leningrad and Volkhov fronts were tasked with mounting operations, despite their depleted manpower and equipment. The 54th Army, reorganized under General Ivan Fedyuninsky, was designated the primary strike force. It received reinforcements in the form of newly mobilized rifle divisions, hastily transferred from the interior of the Soviet Union. However, these units often lacked sufficient artillery support, transport, and training. Many regiments arrived directly from recruitment centers with minimal combat experience. Nonetheless, Soviet planners calculated that even poorly equipped units could be effective if committed in large numbers against the thinly spread German defenses around Manga. The first Soviet counteroffensive was launched in mid-September 1941. Troops of the 310th and 286th Rifle Divisions attacked German lines southeast of Manga, supported by limited tank forces from the 122nd Tank Brigade. The terrain, dominated by swamp and dense forest, slowed the advance. Tanks bogged down in marshes, while infantry faced heavy fire from German machine gun nests positioned along the railway embankments. German artillery batteries, well supplied and coordinated with the Luftwaffe, inflicted heavy losses. The Red Army made only minor penetrations before being repelled. Soviet casualty reports from this offensive estimated more than 12,000 killed, wounded, or missing in just 2 weeks of fighting, compared to several thousand German casualties. The attempt highlighted the imbalance between Soviet determination and their actual capacity at this early stage of the war. Despite the failure, Moscow insisted on renewed efforts. By October 1941, a second offensive was prepared, this time involving the 54th Army in coordination with units of the 8th Army positioned further north. The objective was to create pressure along a broader front, disrupt German supply routes, and exploit any weaknesses. Yet the timing coincided with the onset of autumn rains, turning roads into quagmires and flooding low-lying terrain around Manga logistics again became a decisive factor. Soviet artillery often could not be moved into position, ammunition wagons sank in mud, and food supplies failed to reach frontline troops. Meanwhile, the Germans, though also suffering from weather conditions, held the advantage of fortified positions and shorter supply lines along captured railways. The Second Soviet offensive achieved even less than the first, with only temporary gains in forest sectors before German counterattacks restored their lines. Throughout the autumn, the German High Command considered the possibility of a final assault on Leningrad itself, but Hitler remained insistent that the city should be starved into submission rather than stormed. This strategic choice placed even greater emphasis on Mongya. By holding the Junction, Army Group North ensured that no direct land communications could be restored. For Soviet planners, this meant that the only lifeline into Leningrad during the winter of 1941-42 would be across Lake Ladoga, the so-called Road of Life. Every truck, sledge, and barge that carried supplies across the frozen lake during that winter did so because Muga remained in German hands. As the siege of Leningrad tightened, the Soviet government recognized that further attempts to retake Muga would require more substantial forces. Reinforcements were dispatched from the interior, including Siberian rifle divisions and new tank brigades. However, the broader context of the war worked against such concentration. The German drive toward Moscow in Operation Typhoon in October 1941 forced Stavka to divert many of its best reserves to defend the capital. This left the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts with second-priority units, insufficient artillery, and a chronic shortage of fuel and ammunition. Soviet commanders on the ground, including Fedyuninsky and Meretskov, repeatedly reported that operations toward Muga could not succeed without greater logistical support. Nonetheless, they were ordered to continue launching attacks to keep pressure on German positions. By the end of 1941, Soviet losses in repeated attempts to retake Muga had reached more than 30,000 men, while German divisions in the sector recorded around 6,000, 7,000 casualties. The asymmetry reflected the advantage of the defender in fortified terrain and the Luftwaffe's continued dominance in the skies. Still, German commanders expressed concern in reports to Army Group North headquarters. They noted that Soviet attacks, though often unsuccessful, demonstrated relentless determination. Intelligence suggested that more offensives would follow, with the clear aim of reopening the land corridor to Leningrad. Thus, even as the front stabilized with the onset of winter, both sides anticipated that Muga would remain a primary target in 1942. The strategic planning phase that followed was shaped by two central realities. For the Germans, Muga symbolized the tightening grip on Leningrad, and holding it became a political as well as military imperative. For the Soviets, every plan to break the siege began with retaking Muga, for without the Junction, large-scale resupply of the city remained impossible. In the months to come, the Junction would become synonymous with some of the bloodiest repeated clashes of the entire Eastern Front, as both sides poured men and resources into a battle that neither could afford to abandon. The winter of 1941-42 did not halt the struggle for Muga. Instead, the Junction and its surrounding approaches became the stage for a sequence of fierce engagements as both sides tested each other's defenses. The Soviet High Command identified Muga as one of the most critical points in their strategy to break the siege of Leningrad. By December 1941, the situation in the city had reached catastrophic proportions. Daily bread rations had fallen to as little as 125 grams for civilians. Thousands perished from starvation each day, and public order was strained to the limit. For Stalin and the Stavka, retaking Muga was not simply a matter of military necessity, but also of political survival, as the morale of the entire country was tied to the fate of Leningrad. The first major clash of 1942 in the Muga sector came in January, when the Red Army launched the Lyuban offensive operation. This ambitious undertaking involved the newly formed Volkhov Front under General Kirill Meretskov. While the main effort was directed further south, near the town of Lyuban, subsidiary attacks were planned against Muga to tie down German reserves and exploit any breakthrough. The 54th Army, supported by the 2nd Shock Army, made renewed attempts to advance on the railway junction. Soviet units fought bitterly through the forests and marshes east of Muga, often in temperatures below 30 degrees 6°. German troops, entrenched in fortified bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, repelled the assaults with heavy losses for the attackers. Soviet casualty figures for this phase are estimated at more than 20,000 killed and wounded in the Emga sector alone, while German divisions reported approximately 4,000 casualties. The Soviets learned from these early setbacks. During the spring of 1942, the Stavka emphasized the importance of coordination between artillery and infantry. New attacks on Muga in April and May were preceded by extensive artillery bombardments, sometimes involving more than 1,000 guns concentrated on narrow sectors. Yet terrain once again undermined effectiveness. The marshy ground absorbed much of the blast, and German defensive positions, reinforced by timber, stone, and steel rails from the railway, survived intact. When Soviet infantry advanced, they often encountered machine gun fire from bunkers that had withstood hours of shelling. German defensive doctrine, based on flexible defense in depth, allowed forward outposts to absorb initial blows and then fall back to secondary lines, where counterattacks with reserves restored the situation. One notable confrontation occurred in May 1942, when elements of the Soviet Eighth Army, supported by tank brigades, launched a concentrated assault along the Emga-Volkhov line. Soviet tanks, in several cases, tanks succeeded in breaching the first line of trenches, but without adequate infantry support, they became isolated and were destroyed by German 50mm and 75mm anti-tank guns. Soviet after-action reports admitted that coordination remained poor, with infantry falling behind armor and artillery, failing to shift fire quickly enough to suppress German countermeasures. German accounts praised the resilience of their infantry, but they also noted that Soviet pressure was constant, exhausting their units and requiring frequent relief by reserves. The summer of 1942 saw the largest escalation yet in the fighting for Muga. Following the catastrophic encirclement of the Soviet Second Shock Army near Myasnoye Bor in June, the Red Army leadership was determined to restore its reputation in the Leningrad sector. New offensives were ordered against Muga in July and August. This time, the Soviets assembled stronger forces, including several rifle divisions, tank brigades, and substantial artillery groupings. The 8th and 54th Armies coordinated their efforts in an attempt to retake the Junction and relieve the pressure on Leningrad. The offensive began with a massive artillery preparation on 22 July 1942. Soviet guns fired tens of thousands of shells over a front of several kilometers, creating the illusion of a breakthrough. Infantry units then surged forward, capturing several forward German trenches and threatening the station itself. For 2 days, Soviet troops fought within sight of Emga's railway yards, and some reports even claim that Red Army patrols briefly entered the outskirts of the settlement. However, German reinforcements, including elements of the 96th Infantry Division and heavy artillery batteries, arrived in time to stabilize the situation. Counterattacks forced the Soviets back, and by the end of July, German control over the Junction was restored. Losses on both sides were severe. The Soviets admitted to more than 30,000 casualties in the broader offensive, while German records suggest their own divisions suffered around 8,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Civilian populations in nearby villages suffered as much as the soldiers. German occupation authorities evacuated or deported many inhabitants from the Emga area, fearing collaboration with Soviet partisans. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned, and entire families were displaced. Soviet partisans operating in the forests and marshes targeted German supply convoys, railway tracks, and communications lines. German anti-partisan operations in the autumn of 1942 involved sweeps through the countryside. The civilian struggle became inseparable from the military contest, with the railway serving as both a lifeline for the Germans and a target for the resistance. The cumulative effect of these battles was exhaustion on both sides. German divisions, though successful in holding Umga, were increasingly worn down by constant Soviet assaults. Their supply situation was complicated by the priority given to Army Group Center and Army Group South for the campaigns against Moscow and in the Caucasus. Some German units reported shortages of ammunition and fuel, relying on captured Soviet stockpiles to maintain operations. The Soviets, despite their massive casualties, refused to abandon the objective. Orders from Moscow continued to emphasize the strategic and political necessity of retaking Mara. Soldiers of the Red Army understood that every failed offensive prolonged the starvation inside Leningrad, intensifying their resolve even as losses mounted. By the end of 1942, the battle for Mega had become a symbol of the wider struggle for Leningrad itself. Neither side could disengage without conceding a decisive advantage to the other. German forces recognized that holding the junction was essential to maintaining the siege, while the Soviets understood that liberation of Leningrad depended on its recapture. The result was a cycle of offensives and counteroffensives, trench lines shifting only marginally, and casualties climbing into the tens of thousands. This stage of the battle marked the transformation of Muga from a tactical target into one of the most bitterly contested points on the entire Eastern Front. It set the stage for the even greater clashes of 1943, when the Red Army would marshal larger forces and new operational concepts to finally break the deadlock. The escalation of fighting around Muga reached its peak in early 1943, as Soviet forces prepared their most determined effort to break the German grip on the railway junction. By this time, the strategic picture of the Eastern Front had shifted. The German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943 had altered the balance of momentum, convincing Soviet command that coordinated offensives could achieve decisive results. For the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts, retaking Muga was considered indispensable not only for reopening supply routes into the besieged city, but also for demonstrating that the Red Army could deliver breakthroughs after so many failed attempts. In January 1943, the Soviets launched Operation Iskra, the long-planned offensive to break the blockade of Leningrad. The main attack was directed further north, between Shlisselburg and the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. After 10 days of heavy fighting, Soviet troops of the 67th Army and 2nd Shock Army succeeded in opening a narrow land corridor along the lake's southern coast. A temporary supply route was established, reducing the pressure on the starving city. However, while Iskra achieved its immediate objective, the corridor was only a few kilometers wide and under constant German artillery fire. To secure it fully, the Soviets understood that Muga had to be eliminated as a German stronghold. The Germans, aware of the threat, had reinforced the Mga sector heavily. The 18th Army deployed several divisions, including the 96th and 121st Infantry Divisions, supported by artillery regiments and Luftwaffe detachments. Defensive lines were expanded with multiple trench systems, barbed wire, and fortified bunkers. The railway yards were transformed into a fortress zone, with machine gun positions covering every approach. German engineers also flooded marshy areas to slow Soviet advances, creating artificial obstacles that complicated the movement of tanks and artillery. In February 1943, the Soviets began renewed attacks on Manya. The 54th Army, supported by elements of the 8th Army, was tasked with the offensive. Artillery preparation lasted for hours, with more than 1,500 guns and mortars firing on German lines. Infantry divisions then advanced, making gains in the forests and capturing several forward strongpoints. For several days, the battle raged only a few kilometers from the station. German defenders, however, launched counterattacks with reserves, often supported by dive bombers from the Luftwaffe, which targeted Soviet artillery concentrations. The result was a series of bloody stalemates. Soviet troops would advance hundreds of meters, only to be forced back by counterstrikes. The fighting was exceptionally costly. Soviet records indicate that in the February-March offensives around Muga, the Red Army lost more than 40,000 killed, wounded, or missing. German divisions also suffered heavily, with estimates of 10,000 casualties, though they retained control of the station. German field commanders described the battle as a continuous drain, with units rarely allowed rest. Trenches changed hands multiple times, villages were destroyed by artillery, and entire companies were reduced to a handful of survivors. For civilians, the struggle further devastated the region. Villages near Maga were obliterated in artillery duels. Evacuations were incomplete, leaving families trapped in ruined settlements. Partisan activity also grew during this period, targeting German supply convoys and rail movements. The Germans responded with harsh reprisals, burning suspected partisan villages and executing hostages. The line between military and civilian suffering disappeared almost entirely, as the railway junction became both a battlefield and a zone of repression. By the spring of 1943, it was evident that the Red Army had failed again to secure Maga despite unprecedented effort. Soviet planners revised their strategy, concluding that larger, more coordinated offensives were required. The experiences of these months revealed both the growing power of the Red Army and the resilience of German defenses. For the Soviet command, Maga remained unfinished business, a crucial target that could not be ignored. For the Germans, every successful defense delayed the inevitable, but at the cost of divisions drained of manpower and morale. The stage was set for the final battles of the summer and autumn, when the Red Army would commit even greater resources to end the long struggle over this blood-soaked junction. After the partial lifting of the blockade during Operation Iskra, the Soviet High Command resolved to expand the corridor into Leningrad and secure it permanently. This required removing the German foothold at Emga, which still enabled Army Group North to threaten the tenuous land link along the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. The Stavka's new directive for the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts was clear: capture Maga, widen the corridor, and bring the siege of Leningrad closer to its end. The Soviet command assembled considerable forces for this renewed effort. The 54th Army under General Sergei Roginsky, the 67th Army of the Leningrad Front, and supporting units from the 8th Army were designated for the operation. In total, more than 10 rifle divisions, several tank brigades, and strong artillery groupings were concentrated along the Emja axis. The Soviets also had increasing air support from the Red Air Force, which by mid-1943 had begun to challenge German dominance in the skies. New aircraft, including Yak-9 fighters and Il-2 ground attack planes, were committed to provide close air support for the offensive. German forces, though depleted by attrition across the Eastern Front, recognized the vital importance of Miga and fortified it extensively. The 18th Army deployed multiple divisions, among them the 11th, 21st, and 121st Infantry Divisions, reinforced by artillery and Luftwaffe ground units. Field defenses included reinforced concrete bunkers, trench systems in multiple belts, and pre-sighted artillery covering every approach. German engineers flooded fields and destroyed bridges to complicate Soviet maneuvers. Intelligence assessments reported that the Soviets were preparing a large offensive, and German command prepared to absorb it with flexible defense in depth. The Soviet attack began in July 1943. Artillery barrages opened the assault. With thousands of shells, infantry advanced in waves, supported by tanks and close air support. In the first days, the Soviets achieved localized successes, capturing several forward trenches and pressing into the outskirts of villages near Manja. The 285th Rifle Division and elements of the 124th Tank Brigade advanced within 2 kilometers of the station. For a moment, Soviet commanders believed a breakthrough was imminent. German reserves, however, reacted swiftly. Counterattacks by battalions of the 121st Infantry Division, supported by Stuka dive bombers, restored the situation. Soviet armor suffered heavy losses in marshy terrain and from concealed German anti-tank positions. Many T-34s were disabled before reaching effective firing positions. The Luftwaffe concentrated its efforts in the Emga sector, flying hundreds of sorties to disrupt Soviet supply lines and bombard artillery batteries. Despite Soviet air progress elsewhere on the Eastern Front, in the Emga battles of July, the Germans managed to maintain local air superiority. The intensity of the fighting was reflected in casualty figures. Soviet forces lost an estimated 20,000 men killed or wounded in July alone, with several divisions reporting over 50% casualties. German losses were lower but still significant, with divisional strength reduced by thousands. Both sides endured relentless combat, often fighting for control of individual trenches, railway embankments, or forest clearings. Some positions changed hands multiple times within a single day. By August 1943, the Soviets attempted another push, coordinating the 54th and 67th Armies in a joint attack. Once again, artillery preparation preceded the assault, but results were similar. Gains were measured in hundreds of meters and often reversed by counterattacks. Soviet commanders noted progress in tactics, better coordination between infantry and armor, improved use of smoke screens, and increased artillery density, but the German defenses around Muga remained formidable. For civilians, this phase of the battle brought almost total destruction to the area. Villages around Muga were razed by artillery fire. Surviving inhabitants were evacuated to the rear or forced into labor by occupying authorities. Partisan detachments, supported by Soviet intelligence, increased sabotage efforts, blowing up sections of railway and ambushing German supply convoys. German anti-partisan operations inflicted further hardship, with reprisals leading to widespread civilian casualties. By September 1943, after months of continuous attacks, the Soviets had once again failed to retake Monya. The Red Army's offensives had inflicted serious attrition on German forces. For the Soviets, the failure underscored the resilience of German defenses, even at a time when the Wehrmacht was suffering setbacks at Kursk and along the Dnieper. For the Germans, holding Muga had become symbolic of their ability to maintain the siege, but it came at the price of heavy casualties and exhausted divisions. As autumn approached, Soviet planners reassessed their options. It was clear that further piecemeal assaults would not succeed. New operational concepts were required, involving larger concentrations of artillery, armor, and air power. Muga had become not only a tactical objective, but also a proving ground for Soviet offensive doctrine. The experiences of the summer of 1943 would directly inform the planning of later offensives that would finally break the stalemate in early 1944. By the autumn of 1943, the Soviet command faced the hard truth that the direct assaults on Muga had bled their forces without yielding decisive success. Still, the priority of the operation was unchanged. Without neutralizing this railway junction, the Leningrad corridor remained narrow and vulnerable. The Stavka issued orders to continue pressure, though with greater emphasis on coordination and logistical support. The Leningrad front under General Leonid Govorov and the Volkov front under General Kirill Meretskov adjusted their planning to include more artillery density, the integration of engineer units for clearing obstacles, and closer air support from the Red Air Force. The Germans, anticipating new offensives, reinforced the Emga sector yet again. Reports from Army Group North described the movement of additional artillery batteries, heavy mortars, and fortified fieldworks built using steel rails and concrete salvaged from railway infrastructure. The 18th Army maintained control of the station, with divisions such as the 121st Infantry, supported by the... Though depleted, these formations were experienced and adept at holding defensive lines. They relied heavily on prepared positions and the swampy, forested terrain that naturally favored defenders. The Soviet offensive of September 1943 began with heavy bombardment. Thousands of guns and mortars fired for hours on German positions, targeting trenches, bunkers, and suspected artillery batteries. Infantry divisions advanced in waves, closely followed by tanks and self-propelled guns. In the first days, they achieved measurable progress, overrunning outposts and penetrating the first defensive belt east of Muga. The 54th Army, reported the capture of several fortified villages, while tank units managed to exploit gaps to push toward the railway. However, German countermeasures remained effective. Luftwaffe squadrons, though reduced in number compared to earlier campaigns, continued to launch concentrated strikes against Soviet artillery and supply lines. In several sectors, Soviet troops who had advanced several kilometers were forced to retreat under pressure, leaving the ground covered in heavy casualties. The Soviets attempted to adapt. By late September, they introduced night attacks designed to minimize the effect of German air power. Assault groups infiltrated through forests, cutting German wire obstacles and launching sudden strikes on trenches. Some of these tactics achieved local successes, with Soviet forces seizing segments of the railway embankment. But the Germans responded with counterattacks at dawn, often regaining the positions after bitter fighting. The battle for each stretch of track became a cycle of capture and recapture, leaving the railway line itself shattered and unusable. Casualty figures during these engagements were again severe. Soviet reports estimated more than 25,000 men lost during the September-October offensives, while German records indicate around 6,000, 7,000 casualties. Entire Soviet rifle regiments were reduced to fragments, while German battalions, though victorious in defense, were similarly exhausted. For both sides, Muga had become a grinder, absorbing manpower and resources disproportionate to its size. Meanwhile, partisan activity increased in the region. Soviet irregulars sabotaged rail lines, attacked German convoys, and provided intelligence on troop movements. The Germans responded with large-scale anti-partisan operations, involving entire regiments sweeping through the forests. Civilians caught in these operations often suffered reprisals, with villages destroyed and inhabitants deported. The civilian toll around Muga grew steadily. Soviet forces had not succeeded in capturing Muga, but they had narrowed the German-controlled zone and inflicted cumulative losses. German commanders recognized that the situation was increasingly precarious. Army Group North was overstretched, defending an enormous front with dwindling reserves. The Soviet Union, by contrast, was steadily building up strength, with new units, better logistics, and growing air superiority. By December 1943, both sides were preparing for the next stage of the war. For the Soviets, the MGA offensives had provided lessons in coordination, artillery use, and the need for deeper operational planning. For the Germans, the defense of Memga had tied down resources that were badly needed elsewhere, particularly as the Red Army prepared massive offensives on the central and southern fronts. The Junction remained in Germany. The Leningrad front under General Leonid Govorov, the Volkhov front under General Kirill Meretskov, and the Second Baltic Front under General Andrei Eremenko were all involved in the wider operation. Specific responsibility for the Emga sector fell to the 67th Army and 54th Army, supported by heavy artillery brigades, multiple tank units, and aviation groups. For the first time, Soviet commanders ensured overwhelming superiority in men and equipment. More than 1,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, 400 aircraft, and over 20,000 artillery pieces were concentrated along the entire front. German defenses, though formidable, were weaker than in previous years. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Georg von Küchler, had been bled white by 2 years of continuous fighting. Divisions in the MGA sector were under strength, many operating at half their authorized strength. The 18th Army, responsible for holding Muga, still deployed experienced units such as the 11th, 21st, and 121st Infantry Divisions, but their ranks were filled with replacements lacking combat experience. German defensive doctrine remained robust. Multiple trench lines, bunkers reinforced with concrete, and artillery registered on all likely avenues of attack, but morale was lower and reserves were scarce. The offensive began on 14th January 1944 with an enormous artillery preparation. Soviet guns fired more than 220,000 shells in the first hours, saturating German positions around Muga and along the entire siege line. The bombardment disrupted communications, destroyed forward trenches, and suppressed many German artillery batteries. Soviet infantry divisions advanced immediately after, supported by tanks and storm groups equipped with flamethrowers and German units reported entire companies wiped out before they could retreat to secondary positions. By 16th of January, Soviet troops had broken through German lines east of Mara and advanced toward the station itself. The 67th Army pressed forward from the north, while the 54th Army struck from the southeast, converging on the junction. Fighting was bitter in the forests and villages around the railway, but Soviet superiority in manpower and firepower was decisive. Air support from the 13th Air Army and 15th Air Army provided near-continuous bombing of German strongpoints, cutting off reinforcements and disrupting supply movements. German commanders attempted to regroup for counterattacks, but lacked sufficient reserves. On 21st January 1944, after nearly 2.5 years of repeated battles, Muga was finally liberated. Soviet rifle divisions entered the shattered railway yards, clearing. German reports acknowledged the loss of the junction, citing overwhelming Soviet artillery and air superiority as the decisive factors. In the fighting of mid-January alone, German forces in the sector lost more than 15,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Soviet losses, though higher, estimated at 30,000 casualties, were sustainable in the context of their larger operational success. The fall of Muga had immediate strategic consequences. With the junction in Soviet hands, the land corridor to Leningrad was fully secured. Rail links were quickly restored, allowing supply trains to bring food, fuel, and ammunition into the city on a scale unseen since 1941. The psychological impact was immense. The siege of Leningrad, which had cost more than 1 million civilian lives, was effectively broken. For the Germans, the loss of Muga signaled the collapse of their hold on the region. Army Group North was forced into a general withdrawal to the Panther Line, a defensive position further to the west in Estonia. Civilians in the Leningrad region witnessed both liberation and devastation. The villages around Muga had been reduced to ruins by years of fighting. Railway infrastructure was destroyed, requiring weeks of reconstruction before supply trains could operate normally. Partisans emerged from the forests to assist Soviet troops, guiding them through minefields and pointing out German strongpoints. For the survivors of Leningrad, the restoration of regular supplies meant an end to the worst hunger of the blockade. The liberation of Muga did not end the fighting in the area entirely, as German rearguard actions continued into February. However, the long struggle for the junction was concluded. A battlefield that had consumed tens of thousands of lives from both armies was finally in Soviet hands, and its recapture symbolized the irreversible shift of initiative on the Eastern Front. The Red Army, once incapable of forcing the German defenses at Muga, had now proven itself capable of coordinated operations on a massive scale, heralding the new phase of offensives that would eventually carry Soviet forces to the Baltic states and beyond. The aftermath of the January 1944 breakthrough and the liberation of Muga was marked by rapid changes in both the military and civilian landscape. For the Soviet command, securing the junction was only the beginning of a larger operational push. The January offensive had lifted the siege of Leningrad, but the Germans still held fortified positions to the west, and Army Group North attempted to regroup along the so-called Panther Line, stretching through Narva, Pskov, and Lake Peipus. The Soviets understood that the window of opportunity created by their victory at Muga had to be exploited to prevent the Germans from stabilizing the front. In the weeks following the fall of Muga, engineers and railway troops were immediately deployed to restore the shattered infrastructure. The station itself was in ruins, railway tracks torn up by explosives, yards cratered by years of artillery fire, and bridges demolished in the final German retreat. work brigades of soldiers and civilians, often laboring under artillery harassment from German long-range guns, began repairs. Within a matter of weeks, trains were once again running, carrying food and ammunition directly into Leningrad. For the first time since 1941, the city received sustained overland supplies, transforming the conditions of its inhabitants. Bread rations increased, famine receded, and industries that had been operating at minimal capacity could once again be provisioned with raw materials. Soviet engineers proved capable of repairing lines quickly, often within 24 hours of damage. German documents from February 1944 reveal frustration at the inability to halt the restored Soviet supply flow, which dramatically strengthened the Red Army's ability to sustain operations in the Leningrad sector. For the civilian population, the liberation of Minga and the restoration of the railway represented a dramatic shift from despair to hope. Survivors of the villages surrounding the junction returned to find devastation, houses burned, farmland littered with mines, and cemeteries filled with unmarked graves. Yet reconstruction began immediately. Local populations, alongside Soviet soldiers, rebuilt homes and cleared debris. Refugees who had fled to Leningrad during the years of fighting, at the same time, commissions were established to document German atrocities, including executions, deportations, and the destruction of entire settlements during anti-partisan operations. Casualty figures from the final battles of Minga underscored the scale of the struggle. Soviet records estimated that the January 1944 offensives in the Minga sector had cost them more than 30,000 killed, wounded, or missing, while German losses exceeded 15,000. Combined with the losses from earlier battles between 1941 and 1943, the cumulative toll of the fighting for Minga ran into the hundreds of thousands. For a settlement that in peacetime numbered only a few thousand inhabitants, the disproportionate destruction reflected its strategic importance. As February turned to March 1944, the front line shifted decisively westward, away from the ruins of Minga. The Red Army pressed on toward Luga, Narva, and Pskov, initiating a chain of operations that eventually expelled Army Group North from much of northwestern Russia. Minga itself, once the symbol of German encirclement of Leningrad, now became a logistical hub for Soviet offensives into the Baltic region. The railway junction, repaired and guarded, once again served its original purpose, but this time as a vital artery for the advancing Red Army. The immediate consequences of the German withdrawal from Minga thus combined the restoration of supply lines, the revival of Leningrad's life, and the launching pad for further Soviet offensives. The settlement, reduced to ashes and trenches, had fulfilled its role in history as the battlefield where the fate of Leningrad was decided. Yet even in liberation, the scars of the prolonged conflict remained visible in the land. The legacy of the battles for Minga extended far beyond the ruined junction itself. Between 1941 and 1944, the settlement and its surrounding forests became one of the most contested points of the Eastern Front. The struggle was defined by repeated offensives and counteroffensives, immense casualties, and the transformation of a modest railway station into a symbol of survival and endurance. For the Germans, holding Minga was inseparable from their strategy of starving Leningrad into submission. For the Soviets, retaking it was a matter of both military necessity and national honor. The outcome of the fighting shaped not only the fate of the siege, but also the trajectory of the war in the north. From the German perspective, the defense of Minga illustrated both the strengths and limits of Wehrmacht doctrine. Their fortified positions, efficient use of artillery. The cost, however, was high. German divisions stationed at Minga were ground down by attrition, losing tens of thousands of men in a battle of endurance they could not win indefinitely. By early 1944, The German Army Group North was so weakened by the constant drain of manpower and material that it could not resist the coordinated Soviet offensives. The fall of Maga was thus not only a tactical setback, but also a symptom of Germany's waning strength. The liberation of Maga was both the culmination of this learning process and a demonstration of the Red Army's transformation into a modern, effective fighting force capable of sustained offensive action. The civilian dimension was equally significant. Maga's fate was tied to the survival of Leningrad. As long as the junction remained in German hands, the city endured isolation and famine, resulting in the deaths of more than 1 million inhabitants during the blockade. The reopening of the railway line in early 1944 marked the beginning of recovery for the besieged city. Supplies of food and fuel finally reached Leningrad on a scale sufficient to sustain its population. For the people of the city, the name Munga became associated not only with years of suffering, but also with the eventual breaking of the siege. In Soviet memory, it stood as one of the key sacrifices that allowed Leningrad to endure. In historiography, the battle for Muga is often overshadowed by larger campaigns such as Stalingrad or Kursk. Yet within the context of the Northern Theater, it was one of the most decisive struggles. Its significance lay in its persistence. For more than 2 years, armies clashed repeatedly over the same ground, expending resources and lives in staggering numbers for control of a single junction. Estimates suggest that combined casualties across the multiple offensives and defensive battles in the Emga sector exceeded 200,000 men. This figure, while less than the totals at other famous battles, underscores the grinding nature of warfare on the Leningrad front, where strategic geography turned small towns into critical objectives. The memory of Maga was enshrined in Soviet wartime and post-war commemoration. Memorials were erected to honor the soldiers who died in its capture and defense, and the town itself was rebuilt almost entirely after the war. In Soviet accounts, Maga was described as the railway that bled for Leningrad, a phrase that captured both its strategic role and the immense sacrifices made by Red Army troops and civilians alike. German sources, in contrast, recorded Maga as an example of a defensive victory that delayed Soviet advances but ultimately drained German resources with little strategic payoff. In the broader historical significance, Maga represented the turning of the tide in the north. Its final liberation in January 1944 symbolized the end of the siege of Leningrad, the restoration of the city's life, and the irreversible decline of German military power in the region. The battle demonstrated how geography, logistics, and persistence could elevate an obscure junction into a decisive point in world history. For the men and women who endured the years of fighting, Ma was not simply a railway station. It was the line between starvation and survival, isolation and connection, despair and eventual victory. The railway junction that once dictated the fate of millions thus became a testament to endurance and sacrifice. Its story, though often overshadowed, remains essential to understanding the Eastern Front. A reminder that the war was decided not only by grand offensives and sweeping movements, but also by the relentless struggle for small but vital points on the map. Points like Umga, where the cost of survival was measured in blood.